Finding God in culture. Finding God in the culture around us, the world around us. Here's a definition, might be helpful as we begin. Wikipedia offers this definition for culture: a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution, an organization, a group, a nation, a church, something like that. And hear those words again: attitudes, values, goals, and practices. That speaks to a certain culture. I think if I stopped for a moment and had you talk to 2 or 3 people around you about culture, about our culture, I think the conversation would go on for quite a while. We think about our culture, don't we? For good or for ill, we take time periodically to say, gosh, let me think about this a bit. What do I find there? Now, what are some of the things that would come to mind if we had that kind of conversation for a moment? Well, it might be as simple as things like music or movies. Do they tell us a bit about our culture? Yeah, and there are other things simple like that. It might be very, very positive things come to mind, like altruism. I think when we look at our culture, we do see people wanting to care for others. Or when we glance at culture for a moment, we talk about culture for a moment, we might think about negative things. There are negative things in our culture, aren't there? Things like racism might come to mind. But wherever we land in the discussion, one thing we must trust: God is in the midst of all of that. And so that's what we want to talk about today. Richard Niebuhr wrote a book called Christ in Culture. How many of you have seen that book, held that book, maybe read part of that book, read all of that book, Christ in Culture? There we go. We have a religion major. Daniel, you're letting me down, man. I thought that was probably a book that you have seen, that you have read. So our religion major college student has nailed it. Incredible work, Christ in Culture, where Niebuhr talks about several ways that we can relate to culture. We can choose to relate to culture in a variety of different ways. And so see if any of these ring true for you, how you relate to culture, how you see others relate to culture. First, he says when it comes to culture, we can be against it. Simple as that. Which means, being against it means we try to separate ourselves from culture, from the world, as much as we possibly can. I'm always amazed when I do a little research at how many Christian groups think like this. They know the world is evil. They know there's nothing good in culture. They separate themselves as far as they can from it. And the only energy they put into culture is just standing against what they find there, condemning it. They're not ever thinking, is there some good we can find here? And if there is some good we find in our world, how might we partner with that good? We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes when we get into Paul's journey. But one approach we can take to culture is, we very much can stand against it. Niebuhr says another way we can relate to culture is this: we can view Christ as a Christ of culture. Now, what does that mean? It means as culture changes year after year, decade after decade, century after century, would you agree the culture that Jesus journeyed in, or Paul journeyed in, very different than our culture today? So when we look at Christ as a Christ of culture, we allow the culture to dictate how we interpret who Jesus is. I think especially in our country, that can be very difficult. We can let that color a lot of Jesus's words about, care for the poor, when at times we're thinking, but what's in it for us? Another way we can look at culture. He also says we might relate to culture in this way, and I think this might be where a lot of us land, by seeing Christ as above culture. Which means we're not so much standing against culture, we're not worried about culture at all, because what do we know? A new culture is coming. Our third song today kind of spoke to that in terms of, if we think of Jesus someday coming and bringing in a new kingdom and a new culture, Might as well not worry about the one we're in or really relate to it. Again, not stand against it, but just kind of ignore it. But then he comes to a fourth way that we can relate to the culture around us. And this is the one he leans toward. This is the one that he sees as the biblical approach. And I agree. Fourthly, he says we can see Christ related to culture as a transformer of culture. And that means if we're going to seek and find God in the midst of culture, then we're going to need to really, more than anything else, embrace God's call for us. And what is God's call for us? To relate to culture in the very same way Jesus does. In other words, if we're going to reach out and seek God and find God in culture, then we're going to need to make sure we too are agents of people of transformation as we journey in this world. And understanding that is why our mission is what it is. What is our mission? To make disciples of Jesus Christ for what? For the transformation of the world. As one of the best examples of all of this comes from the Apostle Paul. I love this passage and who we see Paul being in the midst of it. He definitely sees himself as an instrument of transformation in the midst of culture. So to flesh that out a bit more that we might learn from him, let's turn to Acts chapter 17 today. We're going to start with verse 16, Acts 17, verse 16. If you want to follow along, certainly you can turn there now in your Bible or a pew Bible, and I hope our translations are close. Let me set this up, though, while you're doing that. At this point in Paul's ministry, he's taken a break. Not a long break, just a momentary break. He's been in ministry, he's been teaching and preaching. He actually has just been run off from the last country he was in. And so now he is coming to Athens to rest. He wants to recharge his batteries, that's all, right? And being in this city that is in decline, but it's still kind of a center for academic learning, we'll see what happens for him. With that as a backdrop, here's verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, for Silas, for Timothy, while Paul was waiting there, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue. That's always where Paul would start with his teaching. Start in the synagogue, reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. Again, in a city like that, conversations would be happening constantly in the marketplace. He joined in. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, two dominant philosophies of that day, they began to dispute with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? That defined in that day meant it didn't seem like he had a clear and coherent thought. In their opinion, he was just grabbing things from here and there, making up a philosophy that wasn't real strong. Others remarked he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. The Areopagus was the highest legislative council of ancient Athens. They brought him into this meeting and they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears and we want to know what they mean. And then verse 21 tells us two things. One, why they're asking this of him. But two, verse 21 reminds us how Paul now sees an opening. He sees a chance to influence culture, transform culture by engaging in a critical conversation. Verse 21 says, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. And as he senses that part of their culture, he knows they're probably ready to listen if he goes about this in the right way. Now, I share all of this with you today as a way of setting up what comes next. Because what comes next in this very academic environment is Paul now attempting to engage this culture with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think what we can most learn from him when we are trying to find God in culture and function in the same way he is functioning, what we need to most learn from him is this, that when it comes to engaging culture, you gotta ask the right questions. And so here are two questions that he guides us to today. Here's the first thing he says we need to ask when we begin to engage culture. We need to ask this: the things that we see in this culture that we're a part of, what do they mean? Or what do they represent? And as we ask that question and we look more deeply into culture, not condemning it immediately, calling it evil, but beginning to look at some things we find in it, that we might find common ground with the world around us. Being able to look at those things and then ask, how might these things provide an opening for a conversation? On June 4th, 1783, at the market square of a French village not far from Paris, a smoky bonfire on a raised platform was fed by wet straw and old wool rags. Tethered above, straining its lines, was a huge taffeta bag, 33 feet in diameter. In the presence of a respectable assembly and a great many other people, the historians write, and accompanied by great cheering, the balloon was cut from its moorings and set free to rise majestically into the noon sky. 6,000 feet into the air it went, the first public ascent of a balloon and the first step in the history of human flight. It came to earth several miles away in a field where it was promptly attacked by pitchfork-waving peasants and torn to pieces as an instrument of evil. Guys, when Paul came to Athens, first thing he noticed was that this city was full of idols. You know how much that must have bothered him. But instead of going after these idols with a pitchfork, so to speak, instead of immediately calling them evil, instead of telling these people he wanted to talk to, tell you what, you tear down all these idols and then I'll spend some time with you. Instead of doing any of that, which would have gotten him nowhere, here's what Paul does. This is beautiful. Think about just this verse 22. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." And what a great connection. Is that a true statement? Absolutely. You know, some of how they were religious certainly bothered him. But the fact remained, in essence, he was saying to them, clearly you have a soft spot for God because you've got so many of them, right? And what's he doing by approaching things that way? He's allowing for conversation to take place. How many times do you see Christians in this world? Man, they just cut you off from any conversation with someone beyond these walls. Paul doesn't do that. He allows for conversation by finding some common ground with them. Let's continue verse 23. A long section here where he begins to talk about those idols and make the connection with the one true God. "For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands." Again, think about in our series how we're saying, gosh, you find God beyond these walls. He's saying that to them. You're not going to find God just in a temple. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Again, What's Paul doing here? He's calling the Athenians to continue to worship. He's affirming that in them. But he's just saying, you might at least consider worshiping, again, the one true God, because I know him and I know he's in your midst. Great question for us to ask from time to time again is this: what do we already see in our culture that provides an opening for others to find God? And then how can we enter into conversation with others when we see that? I hope an example might help. I think a great example of this relates to music, and especially relates to music in the last 3-4 decades. Imagine several decades ago, some people who were looking at pop music, they were looking at rock music today, and no doubt they were saying, because of their faith, they were saying, I don't think these lyrics are helping anybody. I don't know if this culture, this music culture is positive, right? But they were also asking the question, music though is really touching people's hearts, so why is that, In the midst of their being willing to not condemn, but to simply ask the question, to find some common ground, what happened? Whole new industry of music was formed. Because they were willing to go from condemning the music to beginning to think, gosh, this speaks into people's hearts. Now we have Christian contemporary music that impacts tens of millions of people every day. Impacted us today, right? All because people were willing to look at culture and say, where is the common ground here? How does that offer an open conversation? Now, another question Paul says we need to ask if we're going to find God and help others find God in culture. Another question is this: once we find that common ground and we begin to have conversations, then we ask this: where do we see God already at work in our culture, in our world today? Paul writes in verse 28, "For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your poets have said, we are his offspring." Now, both of these are quotes from Greek literature. Both of these are things that his listeners already knew all about, they were already familiar with. And so here is Paul, in an effort to teach them more about the one true God. Here is Paul saying, in essence, hey, what I'm offering to you today really isn't that new, because these truths of God are already a part of the teachings of your poets. They're already a part of, in other words, the culture you currently live in. And what's he trying to do with that? He's trying to connect the dots for them, showing them that God is already in their midst, and hoping in turn that might cause at least some of them to begin to seek him out, that they might find him. Our problem far too often is that we do approach culture with kind of a here's all that is wrong with it attitude. And that leads us to connect very few dots for those around us. So our task is this: to be able to point out when the time is right. And we've got to find the right time with God's help. But we've got to be able to point out when the time is right, where God is already at work in our culture, in our world, in the hopes that that might lead some of those around us who do not yet know him, that might at least lead them to begin to seek him out, because they do sense, gosh, he is already here with me. Because Paul is willing to engage culture in this way, here's the result. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, imagine that. Also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. And I share that final verse just to say this: when we engage culture in that way, there will be results, just like there were for Paul. Truth is, far too many churches today, far too many Christians today, they truly think they are to remove themselves from culture because culture is all bad. What a gift it is when Paul leads us to a very different approach engaging culture as a way of not just finding God himself, but helping others to do the same. Leo Tolstoy writes, everybody thinks of changing humanity, but nobody thinks of changing himself. My translation of that might be, everyone loves to critique the negatives in our culture, but few have been transformed enough personally by Christ to be able to approach their culture like Christ did. Here's God's call to all of us, that we might see Christ as a transformer of culture. Because when we do that, then when we engage the world around us, we strive to do the same. Let's pray.